Good morning, everybody. Hello. Happy New Year and welcome to 2021 with the OTTX webinar series. It's great to have you all here. We have a great show for you today. As most of you know, I'm Eric Hansen. And on behalf of everyone at OTTX, I want to thank you all for joining us for our initial 2021 edition of the Wednesday webinar series, where we're delighted to bring you thoughtful, insightful, thought-provoking presentations across a broad spectrum of OTT-related topics from thought leaders across our industry. We're excited to be kicking off 2021 today with a presentation from Steve Rosenberg. He is Chief Commercial Officer at Premier Digital. He has over 20 years of media and entertainment experience in media services, post-production, operations, product, and software development, as well as finance. In his current role, Steve oversees Premier Digital's commercial, business development, and marketing activities across Premier's various business lines. He's presenting today on a topic near and dear to my heart, and one that is crucial for organizations in the OTT industry, that of course being the supply chain. I know we're all looking forward to his talk today entitled Mastering the Supply Chain with MAM, DAM, and MDM. First, I also want to thank Premier Digital for participating in our webinar series. They have been great supporters of OTTX, and we're very grateful for their supports and the participation today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve from Premier. Steve, welcome.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's nice to be here. Happy New Year, everyone. It's a great way to start off the year, and hope everybody is staying safe and healthy. So let me see here. I need to share my screen. All right. Feel like this is probably working. Somebody will jump in if it's not.
It looks great.
Terrific. So again, thank you for everybody for signing on, and to OTTX for having me, and Premier the opportunity to present today. Let's see here. There we go. So I'm going to do a quick company summary just for anybody who might be signed on who's not familiar with Premier, and that helps sort of set the stage for what our involvement in supply chain is, and why we consider ourselves one of the experts in the space. So what many of you might know us for is media services. It's really where the company was founded a while back, almost 12 years ago. And that is all of the, media distribution activities to get content ingested, normalized, and prepared and delivered to wherever it might need to go, whether that's distribution endpoints or, other vendors or marketing companies or whatever it might need to be. And as you can imagine, supply chain plays a big part in that, whether you're a company like Premier, or you're doing this yourselves, or just as a content owner or a platform. We're very heavily involved in the distribution and aggregation space. Again, another discipline that forces us to understand things about supply chain, in particular around availabilities and rights, and promotions and price promotions and all those things, and how they tie together with the supply chain, because they are really very heavily coupled, often not really managed that way, which makes it difficult. So understanding this space is really important. We're one of the largest aggregators in the world, probably in the top 3, with well over 100,000 of availabilities on various platforms. And then last but not least, and largely why we're here today, is we've become known in the SaaS product space, and have spent a number of years developing 2 key platforms, one of which we haven't really talked about a lot, but we'll be kind of, we're going to talk about supply chain today, but it's hard for me not to completely refer to how we do it and our view on it. Premier Digital Exchange, which is used for managing titles, metadata, and the like. and then Storefront, which does digital store checking, automated availing, competitor data, and has a global footprint on how to manage and monetize libraries of content. And that is also evolving into AVOD and SVOD as the world shifts heavily in those directions, while TVOD's still a multi-billion-dollar business. So it's clearly still important. So what's a media distribution supply chain? I think it depends who you ask and what your angle on this is. And I threw the word distribution in there because I'm really going to focus primarily on after content leaves post-production and has been largely mastered to the point where it is ready to be distributed. You could think about the supply chain all the way from camera all the way to the very last resting place. But I'm going to cut off kind of at the distribution port with a little bit of archiving included, because those are final assets once they've decided to be archived, and they sort of fit into the conversation. So an answer that we have, and this is one of many answers that could be out there, is that it's a central aggregation point for content and metadata to be ingested, managed, availed, and delivered to various platforms and partners and delivery endpoints. It's kind of a mouthful, but it's really the reality of the situation. If you think about all the disparate assets, asset types, metadata, types of metadata, whether it's technical metadata, product metadata, sales metadata, it all ties back together. And in order to do anything at scale with it and efficiently, it needs to come together. And ultimately, it needs to get normalized, and it needs to be able to then go out to various platforms and partners. So we talk about this, from a supply chain core standpoint. And ours is called Premier Digital Exchange, but it could be your system. It could be other systems or best of breed things that you put together. And there are a number of pieces that go along with it. So the first are like these key software pillars. And these topics are used kind of somewhat interchangeably, certainly with MAM and DAM, and mean different things to different people. So DAM, more traditionally lighter weight assets, MAM, more heavyweight assets like video and audio, and of course, data management for MDM. But really, to have a supply chain that allows you to deliver wherever you need to go, you need to be able to bring these things together, because in a lot of cases, they're required together. So you can go to the broadcast side of the world where metadata is definitely less of an issue because it's not driving packaging or storefronts, but it might be needing to be delivered, all the way to now where we're in the channels world, where the channel is like living off of metadata feeds that contain start dates and end dates. It has other feeds that might contain synopsis, cast and crew, or other information, or even artwork, to the traditional, iTunes package or Google or Amazon package that will require, product metadata, technical metadata, and software metadata. These things all have to be stored and managed in some kind of cohesive method. And so, where we are today, we've got new companies that are starting out. We have old companies with legacy systems and things spread over a number of places. There needs to be a layer or a system where these things come together so that they can, be used to operate. So that's kind of the core of the system. A subset within software, in the software itself, is title management, because title management is extremely complex. It is the basis for how everything comes together. And over the years, certainly having been at the studio for a long time in a previous life, we had never thought about all of the things that we now know we were like, oh, we need to deal with version, but we weren't dealing with franchise. And so, the world was very different back then. But now that we look at it today, you understand that there's all kinds of things we need to deal with here. So title management needs to be robust because of the way that you're assigning assets and metadata to it, as well as the fact of how you want to ultimately get this information and these assets out and delivered wherever they need to go. I think the key here is really a flexible metadata model that allows you to deal with the different kinds of content. Obviously, television is infinitely more complex than movies because of the season, series, episode concepts. Movies tend to have more versions. Then, of course, we've got territory cuts that are specific to various regions of the world, whether it's India or Singapore, or wherever it might be. Could be anywhere, quite frankly. And then we're also seeing new kinds of entrants into the market. There are a number of fitness platforms now, and when you're thinking about those kinds of things, well, they're still working with audio and video and localizations and metadata. But there's also new kinds of metadata around equipment that you might be needing or using, or what this, the program functionality really is that you're looking at. So flexibility there is incredibly important to allow for you to have a single kind of systematic way to understand everything that your organization might be doing. Order management tends to drive the whole process once you've got everything organized. So robust order management in understanding what titles you're assigning to it, what assets are assigned to those titles, and what destination that you want to deliver something to is pretty critical. And in order for there to be scalability and efficiency and a low number of errors, this all has to be tied together pretty closely. And so that's why, we look at it from the standpoint of these, again, core software pillars to bring all these disparate assets and metadata types into one environment under a construct of title management that is robust enough to handle the different kinds of content types that you're dealing with. Again, with orders being able to drive the process of delivery. Moving on from there, then of course there's storage. So none of this works without understanding storage. Now, our belief is that storage needs to be, you have to be storage agnostic, because there's assets that are living in the cloud, they're living on-prem scenarios, they're in disparate systems. You might have artwork in one place, you might have films, features in one, TV in yet another, and it kind of is all over the place. And the idea of moving everything and re-ingesting it so it can all be in a common place is an expensive endeavor that may not get you anywhere, and you might still not avoid storage pools. So our premise is that you have to be able to connect to storage wherever it may be and reference those assets again into these software pillars of data about those assets. Distribution, of course, is the delivery of everything. So you need to be able to transform and package to different specifications, different resolutions, simple stuff, hard stuff, could be channels, could be TVOD, SVOD, AVOD, it doesn't really matter. You need to be able to get your assets out and where they need to go in order to service your business needs. Utilities, another aspect of this for connectivity, workflows, security. We've found the most flexible way to work with people is to enable them to work the way that they need to work and not force them down a path that we need to work in. So having APIs, having single sign-on, BPM, file introspection, all these different kinds of tools to help ease of use, help security, access, understanding of the assets and metadata that you're dealing with, viewability of assets themselves, and just extracting as much data as you can from what you have so that you can populate systems in an intelligent way is really important. And this is an ever-growing list that you're going to need to support. And last but not least, by any means, is visibility. Visibility is critical. Understanding what you have, where it is, what state it's in, when you're expecting things, is really just so critical. And it's the difference between having armies of people and being able to go quickly to having less people going really fast. It's something that we focus on a lot, and as we'll talk about a little bit more, something that we've put in place even with vendors around the industry. Some are competitors, some are complementary, but we know that all our partners, they need to work with who they need to work with. So we can't create an environment that is insular to Premier, and certainly thinking about the supply chains that you might need as either being a platform or being a content owner. You need the flexibility to work with who you want and to understand what your ecosystem looks like. So there's a lot of talk about end-to-end. Our view of end-to-end is really just a visual view of the end-to-end that you use and the people you put in place to support that, as opposed to we do everything from the beginning of distribution and localization all the way to the end state. I don't think anyone truly has the scale to take on everything in all situations. So taking a look at how this kind of works from an implementation standpoint, whether that's here or in your world, the way you're looking at it, our thoughts are that you have this core. I'm sorry, one of my puppies just joined. Hi, Archie. So when we look at this, we have our core that we just looked at and all that functionality around your titles, your assets, your metadata. And so you need a way to asset search and export. So you need to be able to view what's there, be able to get access to it, be able to get it in and out of the system, obviously with the proper security and access. So there's that aspect of it. You need to be able to see what's happening. So you need to be able to query your data. You need to be able to report on it. You need to be able to report on orders. You need to be able to report on assets. You need to be able to report on time statuses. You need to look at things over date ranges. There's all kinds of different aspects of this. You might want to look at assets that you're expecting to receive. So you'll need to be able to track, well, these things are supposed to come in here on these dates from these vendors. I need to see everything that I'm expecting on a title or from a vendor by a certain date. And you can see all that information, because it's really enabling your teams to be able to focus on what's missing. What do I need, or what's broken, so that you can assume that everything else in the pipeline is moving at the pace and correctly that it needs to be moving at. And by focusing on those exceptions and being able to get to them quickly, your team can be much more efficient and spend the rest of their time on higher value tasks than just the admin of chasing, which we all have spent time doing and continue to do. Feeds is a new-ish kind of concept that we've looked at integrating into this environment because they are so tightly coupled. And many of the new platforms, channels, and AVOD are using feeds to support the metadata deliveries that they require. So those feeds tend to be giant XMLs. They could be hundreds of thousands of rows, and they're sitting hosted in some environment on AWS or wherever. Extremely difficult to look at if you want to know what's in one of them. So unlike a normal delivery, you've delivered your package either yourself or you're using a vendor, and you get a confirmation that says it's there, and you could see in a portal potentially, everything that's supposed to be where it's going is there. In the feed world, it's really challenging to see what is actually in that feed. So we've looked at it and created an environment where you can visualize those feeds, because you need to know, are all the titles availed? Is everything that's supposed to be there? What's live, what's not live? It's challenging. So we kind of piggyback that into this environment of supply chain, because that is the kind of last mile there. We work with our own product for availabilities, but understanding availabilities is also critical. So scheduling availabilities is a whole topic in and of itself that I'm not going to go down that road. But your core system that is going to be making all these deliveries in your supply chain needs to understand availabilities, at least to the level of, title, retailer, territory, start date, end date, offer type. That has to be able to get into these core systems, so that it can go in packages, it can go into feeds, it can go as a sidecar. Ultimately, it's all, again, relates back to that title structure. So it's an integral component, and when separated is, much more challenging to manage when it's disparate from all these other things. I guess I haven't really focused much on IDs yet, but it's probably a thought I needed to share was, those IDs are flowing everywhere from, the title at its, start point is to your ID. And of course, you probably are getting IDers. There are retailer IDs, there are store IDs, there are all kinds of experience IDs, et cetera, that go into these various deliveries. You need to be able to manage and track all of that all across the systems as well. Partner integrations. So you're definitely going to have partners, whether they're internal partners, external partners, people that you're working with. You need to have flexibility to bring things in and out of the systems that you use for your supply chain easily. And so, whether that's API driven or not, there needs to be a mechanism for that to tie into what you're doing and tie into your MAM, MDM world, so that everything can line up and be used cleanly. I think it's unrealistic that there's going to be some Uber system that just houses and lives with everything, and you have no external tools or data sets or pools of whatever. So I think integrations and the flexibility to do that is really critical. Integrating with vendors, this kind of gets back to that end-to-end concept, whereby, you can't assume that you're going to never have to work with anyone else. It's just not realistic. And in our case, I put up some examples of things that we've worked on. Ultimately, you can integrate and need to be able to integrate with whomever you're working with. So things that might be, something outside, like if you're a studio, you're probably not doing your own localization internally. You're probably using a host of vendors to do that, who may be around the world, and they're getting proxies and you're getting assets back. IDs are flowing back and forth to identify these things. Being able to control that from a central environment really can improve your efficiency and your understanding of where you're at and your ability to work with and manage those partners. Things go out for ratings. You're sending assets in and out for QC, or you might be using a post-production system or something of that nature. So again, flexibility to integrate with who you need to work with is critical to an environment that's going to, make sense across an organization. So I was going to kind of take us down the user path for a minute and look at some use cases. But before I do, Eric wanted me to certainly put out if there are any questions. I'm happy to answer along the way, or if there are some now, I'm happy to talk about them.
Yeah, so thanks, Steve. That's a great place to kind of segue to some questions. We love to hear from those of you who are attending. We have a great audience today. Thanks everybody for being here. And the best way to do that is just open up the Q&A module and just drop your questions into the Q&A bin, and we'll get to those either now or later. We'll take some as well. Steve, I think it's you make it look so clean with all of these boxes and graphics. They float in. Everything looks so organized, but you also realize in looking all that there is a lot going on. It's actually really complicated, and if many of our members and those attending are maybe not necessarily new in the industry and the business, but they're realizing that the infrastructure that they have and have had is limited in terms of its scalability, and that's good that folks are realizing that. And then the next question is, well, what do we do about it, right? I mean, we've got a spreadsheet, and yes, all the data is coming together into a system, and I'm the system. And what's the next step that we should take to try to enable this kind of automation and scalability?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, and I think companies are not going to just abandon all legacy systems. It's not economically feasible. It's also operationally impractical with IT resources and operational resources, and on top of being just a big investment. So looking at tools that could bring together all of that disparate information so that it's not, well, I'm taking data and assets out of 20 different places and creating all these spreadsheets to send around so that people could take those spreadsheets and put them back into other systems on the other side of the fence. A layer that enables these things to come together, leveraging what you have already, could be very valuable in progressing the efficiency, as well as a setup for, if you wanted to migrate, at least that's a normalization focal point, so that you could then start to think about how you move in another direction. Now, that may or may not make sense to do, but it certainly does from a distribution standpoint, because of course, a lot of these legacy systems are tied to other things at the studio, like, your title management is probably tied to umpteen systems that drive off of it. So you're not just going to go, well, we're going to move it, but another system needs to understand it. I think there are a number of different approaches that could be taken.
Yeah, and all the concepts that you're talking about, they apply to organizations, whether they're in the content creation business or in the distribution business. And increasingly, everybody's involved in all the businesses.
Yeah, for sure. And now, and I have this, right, and that's a good segue, Eric. That check I sent worked well. I put this concept of hybrid in the middle, and there aren't a lot of good logos for hybrid. I found a lot of cars, so I used the battery. Companies are their own platforms now. I mean, Apple, Disney, Amazon, Hulu, like everybody's distributing their content, making content, distributing to the world, and has their own channels. So we've got these new players in addition to the traditional studios and networks that are continuing to do it the way they had been, like a Lionsgate or a Paramount, more in that direction, or an MGM or Sony. So I actually set up a bunch of, not a bunch, but a few use cases that we could kind of walk through to see what this world looks like and what you're really dealing with once you get into use cases. So again, with your core system that is aggregating this information, assets, and metadata into one place with all the various capabilities, you generally people are dealing with various vendors that range from post houses, QC houses, mastering companies, localization companies, ratings vendors, and certainly marketing vendors. And it's interesting because the marketing world and the distribution world often go off on different paths, and the marketing groups like grab all the assets they can grab and they just go do their own thing. But as the world gets more global and you're thinking about version control and do you have the correct localizations, and certainly from a security standpoint and overall control, it's nice to have it centralized where you can see everything you need early on, get easy access to it, move it around to the various vendors in and out. Like from a marketing perspective, some of that marketing goes out, but then goes off a platform into social or wherever it goes. But it might also come back as a trailer that has to fit to a specific platform spec and ultimately go through these distribution channels or feeds or whatever. So having it run through your central organization can create a lot of efficiency. It can also be a little painful because marketing people tend to want to go extremely fast. So you need to be relatively agile to support them. But nonetheless, there are a lot of different players. And of course, I've listed a handful here. There are other types of deliveries that might go in and out from your core assets that come off of production and have been mastered for use. Then, of course, there's delivery destinations. Again, from a distribution standpoint, it could be broadcasters, it could be OTTs, it could be TVOD, SVOD, AVOD, whatever. It really could be anywhere. It could be airlines, anything that you might need to do. There's content fingerprinting, there's festivals and awards, there's media vendors, there's all kinds of places. I just picked a handful here to highlight, what it is. And there might be, an internal platform that you have to deliver to. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. Then it's worth thinking about archiving and preservation as well, because it often kind of gets disassociated from the distribution supply chain. But the reality is, if you start that process up front and you're running it through your central MAM systems, you're registering all of those assets that clearly live under the same title structure into a central place, so that when you got to call them all back, you understand what you have and where it is and how it's being managed. So we think about that as well. Several of us at Premiere came from the studio world, so this is very near and dear to our hearts. And we also have partners who are leveraging, this kind of an environment to manage both. So I think, again, we talked a little bit earlier before about agnostic storage policies. I think that is really important because, not everything's going to be in one place. You might have cloud storage, you might have some on-prem nearline storage, you might have offline in tape robot, or even tapes out of a robot and in the salt mines or wherever. So, the idea of this, a system that is going to support you well into the future is that it just has to have an understanding of where these assets are and a link to them, so that the system understands and where things are. It's not about everything has to be in one place, because again, that's just impractical and isn't really going to happen. There's too much data in too many places. So when you think about use cases here and content sources, let's start with studios and networks sort of doing the traditional distribution business. So in the vendor world, they could use all of these kinds of places. So, you might have an environment where, it's not really integrating with post, but they're, everything comes into a central environment so it can be normalized and everything's synced up cleanly. Proxies might be going out. Localization assets are being created potentially all over the world by a multitude of vendors, and flowing back into an environment where they can then be married up into the title structure, stored, managed, and then ultimately distributed. You might have proxies coming in and going out to ratings vendors so you can get that metadata back, and then those ratings flowing back into this environment. And then, of course, we talked a bit about marketing and what happens there. These assets tend to go to all these places for distribution, fingerprinting, festivals, wherever. Again, I think outside of distribution, often all the ancillary things are being done on the side, and not really run through a central environment. That is fine, but ultimately not as secure, and certainly, not as cleanly managed. It's okay, but this kind of an environment can enable you to go wherever you need to go and onboard whatever partners for delivery you need to onboard. And then, of course, these things need to be archived and preserved. Any questions pop up, Eric, or people being quiet this morning? Or
Yeah, we have
perhaps
a question actually, and it kind of pertains to storage. I think it's really a great time to bring this up as you're talking about archiving, but also where content lives. It may be, even if it's not archived, it may be in the cloud, it may be in my own proprietary system, it could be someplace else. To kind of summarize the question, are you seeing studios getting comfortable with putting their heavy assets, their the crown jewels into the cloud storage with AWS, Azure, Google, and IBM?
so we have seen a partner who is comfortable with doing that. I haven't surveyed friends around town, so to speak, but we definitely have a partner who is comfortable replicating assets into a cloud environment. But there's still a multi-copy strategy so that there is backup and protection. Going back in the day, and I haven't done this in a while, but when I was managing the library at Fox, the only way to ensure the library was to have multiple copies, because you obviously can't remake a movie from the 50s if half the actors are no longer with us, nor would you anyways. You're really ensuring a copy of the assets in the event that another copy is lost. So I haven't seen anybody go to cloud only. I think you're seeing a mix of cloud and offline, just to be safe.
But they're at least starting, some studios are at least starting to be comfortable, I'm talking about majors, I guess, putting their assets in the cloud. I think security had been really a concern over the last, really since cloud storage was a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I know we work with some outside firms that specialize in cloud security because it's such a huge issue, and we want to make sure we're working with the most well-versed people in the space, because it's a serious issue. Now, sometimes it can obviously be Premier could be facilitating delivery into somebody else's cloud environment. They're just a destination and they manage all the security and access on their end. But even in our own environment, we employ a outside firm to help us with cloud security.
Well, I'm just hearing from one of our attendees that Netflix has their content in the cloud. So certainly a vote of confidence for those of you who are attending and still getting comfortable with the idea. I remember hearing a presentation from a year or two back from someone at Google who was managing their cloud system. And he was explaining that their system on a minute by minute basis, they're defending against nation states. And so their security is so incredibly hardened, because it has to be, compared to anything that you might have on-prem. The amount of resources that these organizations are putting into security, no other organizations really have. So that's just something that might give you confidence in what they're able to achieve.
Yeah. Well, and I think also file size is, becoming another issue too.
Sure.
It's like, in the old days, somebody could give you an HD movie on a drive. Now it's like you want to get, an HDR feature, 4K. It's many, many terabytes. So, the volume of the data is pretty voluminous at this point. So non-cloud-based mechanisms are also challenging.
Sure. Yeah. It's going to come to the point where, in order to compete, there are going to be companies and organizations that are trusting the cloud, and they're going to be able to move faster and more efficiently. And in order to compete, I think, it's going to be one of those kind of turning points where we just have to acknowledge. But I think, to your point, having backups in other locations certainly makes sense. It's not meant to be your only storage point, but in terms of managing your distribution and having accessible assets, that seems to be there's a lot of advantages.
Yeah, and asset accessibility, not just from archival assets, but from distribution assets, is incredibly important when one of the platforms is like, great, this is a huge success. I now need 1,000 titles from each of my providers. Really quickly, if that stuff's all sitting offline, it's a process to get it back restored into a production environment so that it can be, either manipulated and or just packaged and delivered. An offline environment isn't going to be the most robust in terms of the speed to do that. And people are moving quickly these days with large volumes. And I'm obviously, with the pandemic and so many people watching, Netflix and Disney Plus and, Amazon channels and the list just goes on and on and on, Pluto and Apple channels and everywhere. They're ingesting huge amounts of content. People are digging into their catalogs. So the more readily available it is, the easier and it can get where it's going at a lower cost and certainly a more efficient pace, which is what you want for monetization.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a question here, and I have to say I don't really understand it, so I'm going to throw it out there. This is from Peter. Thanks, Peter. Thoughts on drone operations or operator and need for media asset management? Any experience with that? I don't know what drone operations are.
I mean, I don't know.
And maybe it's a content production question. So, Peter, if you want to drop some more detail on that, or raise your hand and join us online. We'd love to bring you into our conversation live. Okay, Steve, with that, can I turn it back over to you to carry on?
Yeah. So the next, you can look at is hybrid, which really is very similar to the studio, except now you're delivering into your own platform. So we've added that little green bar there. And of course, any assets that you're delivering to your own platform, you're of course going to want to save and archive. So whether this is, an Apple show or a Hulu show or, Mandalorian is going to, just Disney Plus. And then the last view is kind of looking at, there we go. And the last view is just looking at, if you're a platform and taking the reverse of this situation, this is just as important on the platform side. So there's all these burgeoning new platforms starting up, and they're growing rapidly and are facing these same challenges of lots of assets and metadata coming in. Excuse me for one moment. Thank you. So, you've got providers from potentially all over the world or a particular region. You have many of them, and they of course have this whole environment in some incarnation, and they're just fire hosing you assets and metadata. So on the platform side, you're really dealing with the same kinds of challenges around, we have assets, we have metadata, we have title structure, we have IDs, all of those things. And while there are numerous standards, there's the EMA standard for avails, there's an asset standards, there's ITER, that isn't all in place everywhere by everyone. So obviously leveraging those standards is really valuable. However, we live in this hybrid world, so to speak, of people using and not using. And so as these platforms get up to speed, building this infrastructure that's beyond their actual consumer offering is a whole nother endeavor. And, there are ways to achieve this kind of organization efficiency so that your team can focus on your product and your customers more than the back end administration of some of these things. So, those people are dealing with studios and networks, content flowing in. It's probably going to need to be conformed. So, as much as we'd like at this point that there was just this single pool of assets that was all lined up, conformed, and ready to go anywhere, things tend not to work that way. So things need to be sunk up and mastered and delivered and normalized, and ultimately maybe even QC'd by third party so they can be packaged and delivered to these platforms. And it's possible that those platforms also ultimately need to have some level of archiving and preservation for, mezzanine files once they've received them, so that if they needed to be reused or re-encoded, they could be without having to ask for redeliveries. So this kind of distribution supply chain really applies to all sides of the ecosystem and takes into account all of these different facets to really enable content to get to platforms that are being used by consumers, or to environments that ultimately distribute that platform to consumers. So this is the way we've thought about it. We've been working on this kind of stuff for really all of Premier's existence, very heavily in the last 6 years or so, and really hadn't come to market as a product until very recently. We've again been known largely as a media services environment, but we're now in this place where we want to help people with the tools that we have, not just as a managed service, but also as a SaaS platform, or both. And that's why we've spent a lot of time thinking about it and how to make this efficient and functional for the world that we're living in today. And that's kind of our story.
I love the way you've laid this out. And this is the supply chain in all of the things you have to think about when you're. You don't really. I think your supply chains tend to evolve. No one just says, "Okay, we're going to do a video service. We're going to distribute our content. We're going to have a platform. Let's build a supply chain." It doesn't really happen that way. It's like, well, hey, here's our 10 titles that we've just licensed or we've just made, and we'll send them out. And then you realize you need to track a few things, so that goes into a spreadsheet, and you've got a bunch of other stuff in a different spreadsheet, and it kind of works. And that's really your supply chain. But if you look at it from the top level, there's so much to think about, and there's so much that you're gonna get your system, whatever it is, whether it's you or some kind of a automated or a system with automatable components, you're gonna have to get involved in all of it. And so it's really smart to think about this kind of stuff early as possible in the process. We do have a few questions here. I wanted to give our friend Peter a chance to join us. Peter, I'm going to allow you to talk. Let's see. There we go. Are you there, Peter? You just have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
All right, good. I'm Peter. I'm actually, just by way of introduction, the CEO of a company called Iada Content Management. Our main capability is to apply something called in-frame time-based descriptive metadata directly to an object in a frame. My one sentence sales pitch on that is it optimizes search discovery and marketing and as such. My question goes to, and I guess I have found, given that I can sell into, a number of industries, I have found with drone operators, the use of drones grew so quickly, but the use of drones is primarily based on producing still photos, video, and data, okay? But because it grew up so quickly, given the, I guess, entrepreneurial cowboys out there, they missed the, they missed the opportunity to realize that given all the video stills and stuff, that requires media asset management. Okay, so this has become a big beachhead, from my perspective in terms of our solution. So my question really went to Steve. Given the company's markets, have they bumped up against that? Any experience?
We don't have any experience with those kinds of folks. Our primary position in the industry is really with like major platforms and sort of long form content providers that range from filmmakers to major studios. We actually have like DIY software for individual filmmakers to distribute their titles, but the bulk of our business is with large rights holders and distributors and major studios going to major platforms. I suppose if a drone operating organization had that much content that it needed to manage and had enough distribution endpoints for it, sure, I don't see why something like this wouldn't be needed. And they definitely need something on a smaller scale, to manage all this, media that they bring in if they want to monetize it. Because if it just sits in a bunch of folders and you can't find what you're looking for and it's not organized well, it becomes an untenable, task to dig into it and figure out how to get money out of it.
That's like kind of the Uberpoint. And thank you, Peter, for bringing that up. Uberpoint is the importance of connecting production with distribution and operations in order to really monetize and continue to add value against the assets that you're creating. There's a lot of valuable data that is being used and created in the production process, and traditionally it just gets thrown away. It's not really, hasn't been leveraged. You have, as one example, you might have an inventory listing of all of the stuff that you used on production, all of the props, all of the wardrobe, all of that it's in a catalog somewhere. That'd be really valuable to have after your production gets made, because then you can attach, and where it was used, you could attach that to your content and work on monetizing it. You could add it to your experience. So the data is there, and I guess I'm just kind of pointing out, and something to think about is during the production process, taking that data and making it accessible, as you're saying, to the rest of your downstream systems can be really valuable and can be a difference maker for you and your service and your content. Here's a question also from Jonathan, asking to explain more on localizations. So Jonathan, I am not clear on, do you mean what do we mean by localizations, or how Premiere specifically is managing them? If you want to raise your hand, we can get a little clarity on that from you. It'd be great to hear from you. It's fun to have folks joining us. As well, one of the things we've been talking about is I think the tendency for organizations, big or small, in the supply chain space is to kind of build it themselves. And with the thought of, one, I need to go really fast. I don't have time to go out and talk to somebody that's a vendor. Two, I need to control it myself. I want to be able to, if I need to change something, I don't want to have to wait for a vendor, a partner to do this for me. And three, maybe it's like, I feel like it's going to be too expensive. How would you respond to some of those comments from folks that are doing this already and maybe building their own?
Yeah, I mean, it can certainly work a bunch of different ways. But the two primary paths I see is, the person that needs the localization done will go out and engage all the vendors themselves. And that could be one of two things. They could pick a localization vendor who then just figures out how to get everything they need because, I need Japanese dubbing and I don't own that, but I can control the subtitling and they can just administrate the whole thing. The content owner can just go hire whoever they want. There's also the path where somebody comes to like Premiere and says, hey, I need you to administrate this for me along with everything else you're doing. And we have relationships with pretty much all the major localization companies, and we can administrate that too, which we do on our own for a lot of our aggregation business anyways. So we're a pretty decent buyer of those services in the market. And because of some of our partner relationships and the things that I've highlighted in this presentation, it's been important for us to connect with those companies as well, so that there can be a more seamless integration of it. So that localization can happen in any way. I think the key really, regardless of the path that you choose of those, is that it fits a structure of this ecosystem that needs to be built in your supply chain so that it can work efficiently, so that proxies can get out, everybody's clear what it's related to, assets can come back, again, everyone's clear what it's related to, and then they can be married up with the various elements and then get out. Or even metadata localization, making sure it's getting into the system, tied to the titles correctly, which territories it's for, what language it's in, like all of that needs to be accounted for if you're going to have a smooth operation where things get delivered correctly. So this core infrastructure concept of the supply
as you pointed out, and building it in a silo by itself, it's just making, ultimately it's going to make it really challenging. It has to come together. So we are bumping up against time. In fact, we're at time. So I want to thank you very much for your presentation. It's really great. We could talk about this for a really long time. I know I could. OTTX members can also get their hands on the PowerPoint presentation and a whole lot of other valuable videos and resources. We're so happy to be kicking off 2021 with a bang, and we've got a lot of activities, opportunities, connect, and events slated for the next year. You can check those out on our website. Coming up next, later this month, is the Leadership Development Foundation online auction. It's going to be running from January 21st to the 28th. You'll have a chance to bid on some unique items and experiences and support the OTTX Leadership Development Foundation's efforts to develop future leaders and to encourage inclusion and diversity in the OTT industry. Thank everybody for their participation and support. Of course, our first major event of 2021, the OTTX Spring Summit, March 9th through 11th. So we want to take a look at what's happening there. We have a tremendous schedule of events, and get yourself registered. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great rest of your day and Happy New Year.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Steve.